All right. Konnichiwa, aloha nui, everybody. My name is Kale Ruiz, and I will introduce myself in the first part of the presentation here. I am representing the University of Hawaii, where I'm a faculty member, but also Queerify, which is a public service project that I created that I'll talk a little bit more about at the end. But in today's presentation, we're going to talk about decolonizing LGBTQ plus in a Western and in a setting and in Hawaii, where we're going to unsettle colonial architecture. So the point of this is going to be look at how colonization is the bedrock of many prejudices and ills in our society, especially around queer issues. So just really quick to introduce myself, Oao no Kia means this is me. So my full name is kaleikūkamakani Ruiz, but people just call me Kale or Le. I am Kanaka Maoli, which is native Hawaiian, from my mother's father. And then on my father's side, my family are, I'm fourth generation of Filipino settlers, Tagalog and Ilocano. And on my mother's side, I am Korean and Japanese. And in terms of queerness, I would describe myself as Mahu, which is like someone who is in between Kane, male, and Wahine, female. And Ha'awahine, that descriptor means someone who is internally a woman or Wahine, culturally, spiritually, psychologically, just feels as a woman. Um, I am associate professor and counselor at Leeward Community College on the island of Oahu, which is where Honolulu is. And in August 2024, I went on a sabbatical till February 2025, a research sabbatical in which I investigated the intersections between Hawaiian worldview, colonization, settler colonialism, and LGBTQ plus discourse. And in exploring these themes, I was really looking into the intersections of gender, sex, and the body and how they are used as tools of domination and conquest. Now, speaking of domination, right now in the United States, there is so much motion politically and socially around the issue of gender and sexuality and LGBTQ plus. There's lots of legislation being proposed to influence access to rights and access to even be able to say the word gay or talk about gender and sexuality. And this legislation and the discourse around it has real effects on the LGBTQ plus community, including negative impacts on mental health and also higher rates of suicide. So when I look at social ills like this, one of the first things I think of as especially as an indigenous person is, all right, what is the root of this? What does the past tell us about this? Now in Hawaiian, we have a concept called huliau. So huli means to turn, reverse, or to change. And au can mean a period of time, cycle, passing of time, current, or to flow as a current. And when we put these two words together, it is to think of or recall the past to inform our present or future. Now, I really like the idea of it as a current, think of a stream. So if a stream is flowing, if everything is connected along that stream, right? If there is, say, a poisonous substance put in at the upstream, it's going to flow downstream, right? And if we think about it as time, if something is harmful earlier in the past, it does not stay in the past. It flows forward with us and it's going to keep following us until we address it. And that's kind of what we're going to do today is address what does the past tell us about how we think, feel, and act today, especially in relation to LGBTQ plus. So let's look to the past and let's see what the past says about gender and sexuality. Throughout recorded history and since time immemorial, thriving cultures have recognized, revered, and integrated more than two genders. This quote comes from Independent Lens, a project with the Public Broadcasting Service. And in this map, all these blue flags indicate a culture, a people who had roles or identities or people who were not male or female. You'll notice that it's all over the globe on every continent, and this is not all of it either. This is just what they've been able to research so far. As a matter of fact, sexual diversity has historically been the norm, not the exception among indigenous peoples. Ancestral tongues prove it. So when we look at this, this is just a smattering, just a little bit of the words that are out there. The blue are from various places in Pacifica. The orange is from Native American groups. The green is from Southeast Asia. The yellow is from Africa. And the pink is from South America. And there are many more. And when we look at this, when we see it was on every continent, when we see that it's been across global languages, what this tells us is that human diversity along the lines of what we call gender and sexuality today is a centuries-old reality. It's not something new. And when you look at these concepts, there was an emphasis on social role versus physical form. Many indigenous cultures saw people as what they, not the body they were born in, but how did they relate to others and contribute to their community. And lastly, there was power seen in the ability to traverse genders. If someone could channel both male and female energy or cross over, they were often given roles related to religion, spirituality, and healing, which means they were integral to their community. Whereas very different from modern times, a lot of times queer people are treated as outsiders. So when we look at this history, what changed? What happened across the globe? And that is colonization, because colonization was a global effort to create capitalism. So colonization is, I'm going to go with some descriptions from Dr. Horvath, but it's a capitalist project and it's about economic exploitation. So when colonizing groups go to a place, they want to exploit the natural resources. That's what they're there for. But when they get there, very often, if not every single time, there's a thriving people there with a thriving culture. So now how do they get to the land? They have to control the people, dominate them. And this happens through culture change, where they seek to establish Western worldview or colonial worldview as superior to the indigenous way of life. And this is where the concepts of race and gender come in. They're used in concert to inferiorize and dehumanize people. Because in order to dominate someone, you can't really care about them or see them as human. You need to see them as lesser. And lots of researchers point out that that concept did not exist before the colonization of the Americas. So it was something that was deliberately created in order to dehumanize indigenous peoples. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to map colonial severing. So when I say severing, colonization sought to cut people off from their roots, the way they lived, the way they thought, the way they were. It sought to cut them off from that so that they could be assimilated into the capitalist system. So let's take a look at this severing and how it worked. So when the colonizing groups came to this, whatever land it was, whether it was Africa, Hawaii, the Americas, they looked at indigenous gender systems and took issue with some of the practices. And there's three themes here I'm going to look at. First is hermaphrodites. So that actually comes from Greek language, and it's based on the idea of Hermaphroditus, who was a demigod who blended or merged with a nymph or a naiad. And so, interestingly, hermaphrodite in Greek thinking actually represents something positive, a balance between male and female. Whereas when it was weaponized in colonization, hermaphrodites were seen as abnormal. People who had, mixed genitalia and there's something biologically wrong with them. And one of the things that colonizers did was look at these peoples and say, wow, they have so many more hermaphrodites than us. There's so many of them, because they would see people who crossed the gender line, especially men who crossed over into women's roles. And they saw that as a very bad thing. This connected to effeminacy. So the capitalist project, colonization, is very masculine, where you're dominating, right? You can't care. And effeminacy, women, and that kind of caring work is associated with care and community. So this is where effeminacy was seen as a very bad thing, especially when men crossed that line into women's duties or roles. And lastly, when you're in a indigenous gender system where there is not the gender binary, not just male and female, there were same-sex relationships, and these were painted as sin, as vices. And this is where two themes come in. you have the science direction, race science, and then religion. So on the race science side, what colonizers sought to do was establish these differences as biology. Okay, so these people look different from us, and they all their bodies are different from us, and they use their bodies different from us. They are this can't be educated out of them. It's just intrinsically in their DNA. And so they're animals, they're bestial, they're childlike, they're impoverished. And then on the religion side is where morality came in, where it looked at these people as, oh, they don't know any better. They're so immoral, they're demonic, they're heathen or pagan, basically outside of the bounds of what Christianity said was correct, which was the gender binary and heterosexuality. Now, both of these narratives intersected at establishing indigenous people as uncivilized, as lesser, as not human. So, interestingly, these two narratives spawn two different ways of approaching these uncivilized people. One is on the race science side, and in terms of colonization, it's creating emotional distance between the colonizer and the people they are colonizing. So you have it where again, you cannot care about people you are dominating. So establishing them as animals, right, allows the colonizers to treat them with less respect and to dominate them. And then on the religion side, this one was a little different, is it's saviorism, where missionaries would write about, oh my goodness, these people have no sexual discipline. There's just so much wrong with how they live. We're going to save them. We're going to educate them about the ways of Christianity and save them from their heathen ways. Now, both of these narratives eventually intersect at actions of elimination, and this happens in different ways. One way that indigenous people were eliminated was through genocide, through mass killing, or through the introduction of foreign diseases. And the thing with diseases is some people don't often see that as genocide, but as an example, when Captain Cook came to Hawaii, he had already journaled about how diseases decimated other indigenous populations he had gone to. So he was aware, and so was his crew, but they still engaged with the native people anyways and introduced those diseases. And so that resulted in mass death for Native Hawaiians. So genocide can be any kind of killing, not necessarily just violence, but also through diseases. And then for those who are not killed, then you have assimilation, where they become assimilated into the capitalist system and become labor for it. They become workers or just part of the settler institution. And also, in terms of Hawaii, our culture becomes assimilated in that it's used for the tourism industry, right? The aloha spirit, racial harmony. Hawaii is a place for everybody to come. That's all used for capitalist pursuits of encouraging tourism. So that's another form of assimilation that can happen. So this is kind of the mapping of this severing. And now we're gonna do a quick tour of different places in the world. And we're gonna start in North America to see how colonizers wrote or talked or conceptualized about indigenous people. Now, as I had mentioned, they often focused on the ubiquity of hermaphrodites. There's so many of them with the Native Americans. And then they also looked at when two-spirit people, as they call themselves two-spirit people, would take on roles of male and females. And so the missionaries looked at them and said, oh, they're burden bearers. They are captives. They are slaves to their own people. This is why these people are inferior, because they're so barbaric with how they treat these people. They also, Spanish colonizers employed something called a confessionario. And a confessionario is kind of like Catholic confession. But what they would do is they would grill indigenous people about their sex and gender. They would ask them all kinds of invasive questions about, like, who are you having sex with? Why? What are you doing? And indigenous people from different places would respond in different ways. Sometimes they just wouldn't engage at all, or sometimes they would answer, but they didn't understand why they were having to answer these questions. But it was a very invasive way of trying to inferiorize their way of life and telling them that it was wrong. And of course, in telling them it was wrong, you have ideas like sodomy, and labeling it as unnatural, same-sex relationships, people who are neither male nor female. And in this, they sought to exterminate sodomites, because the other thing about two-spirit, mahu, babaylan, All these different people who were in the middle and they were spiritual guides or healers in their community, they were the connection to the culture. So they had to be eliminated. So I warn you, the next picture is very graphic. But this is a picture of Balboa's massacre of the Cueva people in 1655. This is in the Denver Art Museum. And as you can see, the Spanish colonizers would gather two-spirit people and sick attack dogs on them and have them rip them apart. So this is an example, right, of very clear genocide, trying to eliminate this people. This was actually, sadly, a common practice in the North Americas when the Spanish were doing colonization. And one thing I point out to people when I show this picture is today, in modern times, there is still so much vitriol, there's so much violence against trans and non-binary people. And it's because it started here. The root of it goes all the way back to this, where this violence was this disgust with people who are trans or non-binary that we call them today. It started here and it has followed us to the present. Now let's go over to Africa. Now in Africa, there was a crusade to establish what is true hermaphroditism. What are real hermaphrodites? And juxtaposing it with normal bodies, specifically African bodies to European bodies. Again, trying to separate and dehumanize. African bodies were seen as monstrous. It gave birth to this study called teratology. Teratology can translate to, not translate, but it can mean the study of abnormalities, but it can also mean the study of monsters. And the reason they would do this, they would like take pictures of African bodies, they would measure their genitalia, they would do all kinds of invasive things. And it was largely to dehumanize in the interest of slavery, because again, creating emotional distance, being able to see these people as lesser than us, we can enslave them and dominate them. And so racism, transphobia, and this kind of interrogation intersected again in modern, again, when we don't address the root, it follows us forward in the stream. Caster Semenya, Olympic gold medalist who had her gold medal taken away. Caster Semenya was born a woman. On her birth certificate, it says that, but she does have a condition that has to do with testosterone. And because she looks a little more masculine, the sports world, when she won her gold medal, they it invalidated her victory and said, "You're a man. You cheated. There's something wrong here because you're not a full woman." And it was racist and transphobic because a lot of the criticism was coming from white athletes and white sportscasters. And South Africans stepped up for Caster and they said, "This is the same thing y'all did to us a long time, throughout colonization. This is colonization happening in the present." So that's another thing about colonization. A lot of times, especially those who, are in a particular space and context, they would be the colonizer in that situation. They don't want to acknowledge that colonization happens today, but it does. It has not ended. Now let's go to the Philippines. In the Philippines, let's go to linguistics. Spanish translations of things that Filipino words that meant like the body, genitalia, or lust or sex, they were translated as dishonesty. And this is an example of colonial severing, where they wanted to get people to distrust their way of life, distrust their desires, distrust their bodies through those Spanish translations. And confessionarios, again, were implemented with the Filipinos, where they were questioned about their gender and sexuality. There was also the element of Spanish machismo, where men are dominant, women are disempowered in the colonial perspective. And there was persecution of the babaylan. Babaylan were like two-spirit, like Mahu, people who were in the middle and were healers. And they were also exterminated as well, just like the two-spirit. And they were also called bakla. Some of you may have heard that word before. It's usually spelled with a K in Filipino language, but in Spanish language, it was originally spelled, based on the research I found, was BACLA, bakla, which meant confused or cowardly. Again, this is more of that revulsion of effeminacy in men. And lastly, for Hawaii, this one I'm going over short because I have the online course that goes way more in depth to this, but Mahu were also seen as hermaphrodites. Aikane, which is a form of same-sex relationship, was seen as sinful. And there was an outlawing of uncivilized customs. Dr. Mary, the late Dr. Mary, was an anthropologist who actually studied how the legal system was weaponized against Hawaiians. So, Hawaiian ways of gender and sexuality were so different from monogamous marriage and Western thought, and it was all criminalized. And so, when people were charged with these crimes, it was like 82% of the defendants were Native Hawaiians. So, it was a way to sever Hawaiians from their way of life. And then also to establish them as inferior and to say these people can't govern their sexual desires or their bodies. They can't govern themselves. How can they govern a nation? Therefore, we can take the nation. And then that is what happened when Hawaii was overthrown. Yeah. So with that information, this history, basically what we're looking at here is that race and gender are productions of conquest, of colonization and domination. Colonization is the dehumanizing subjugation of indigenous people and worldview through racialized stories of gender and sexuality. Now, I colored these words specifically because we often talk about these things as separate. They cannot be discussed separately because race, gender, and sexuality were used in concert in the process of colonization to dehumanize indigenous people. So these things cannot be talked about separately, even though at least in the US and here in Hawaii, it's often talked about as separate. And I will say when I have given some of these presentations, I get some very defensive responses sometimes angry responses. And to articulate what they say, I'm going to point out the four C's of colonization here. So colonization is the process to create capitalism across the globe. Christianity was a tool to insert morality into the situation, and then it all is in the interest of control. Now, what we are, at least in the US and in Hawaii, usually what we'll talk about is, yeah, control is not bad. We should not be controlling how people identify and who they have sex with. It's nobody's business. Then we've gotten to the place in the 90s talking about how religion should not oppress people because they are queer. And lately, there's been more conversation about capitalism, saying, like, when corporations cater to LGBT and Pride Month, it's not because they care about the community, it's because they want our money. So those three bottom layers have been talked about, but as soon as I get to colonization, people get uncomfortable. And understandably so, because it's complex and it also makes some people very aware of their privilege that they have in specific contexts. And I've had people tell me straight up, colonization is not the problem, capitalism is. But the thing is, colonization and capitalism cannot be separated either, because colonization was the process by which capitalism was created. Capitalism did not arise just in Europe spontaneously. It was created by how certain European groups related to the rest of the world. So, and another thing too is I used to get some defensive responses where people would say, well, Europeans had queerness too. We had people in the middle. I know. And what I have to explain to them is don't forget that colonization is not European culture. Those are two completely different things. And as a matter of fact, when certain Europeans like Cook and others like that were wanting to begin colonization, they suppressed queer people in Europe as well. So colonization is not European culture, it's separate. Um, but here's the thing. When we don't talk about colonization and we omit it from LGBTQ plus discourse, we risk replicating domination. We risk continuing colonization today. And specifically through epistemic domination, especially nowadays, because we don't have a lot of widespread mainstream violence, but there's a lot of epistemic domination still happening, which is the domination of one form of knowledge over another. So I have a couple of quotes here. Binawan is a Filipina trans scholar, and she said, when we talk about certain labels in LGBT, it's normalizing one way to conceptualize gender, one narrative, one story. And Aditya had said there's danger in a single story because that's what colonization did. It tried to erase indigenous stories and replace it just with the capitalist Christian story in order to dominate, right? Because if you can say our way is the only right way and the rest of you need to just follow, that is domination. So I'm going to go through some LGBTQ plus frameworks that In particular, Americans and even people here in Hawaii are very connected to emotionally, but they may not necessarily be completely beneficial in our discourse. So let's start with LGBTQ plus identities, lesbian, gay, transgender, pansexual, all of those. The thing with these labels is, although they're framed as often challenging the gender binary, it actually centers it. It normalizes Western understandings of being. So, for instance, if someone says, I am lesbian, gay, or bisexual, that is in proximity to heterosexual. It's saying I'm not heterosexual, I'm something else other than that. Heterosexuality is at the center. When someone says, and if I have to describe myself in English, I usually say non-binary. But if I'm non-binary, I'm in proximity to the binary. It's still centering the binary. And this is centered in other ways. Like when I talk about educate people about Mahu being Mahu, people will very often go, it's a gender identity, right? And I have to explain over and over, it is not a gender identity because gender identity is an English word and it has Western worldview with it. So we cannot talk about Mahu as gender because it's from a completely different worldview. And there's also the idea of third gender. Okay, so this term is used a lot. It's always bothered me, and I never could fully articulate why until I read a book by Amanda Swar, who is the researcher that I looked at for the information about Africa and colonization. Third gender has become kind of a racist other box where if it's not in the gender binary or male or female, throw it in the third gender bucket. So if it's Mahu, third gender. Babaylan, third gender. All these other indigenous concepts, they just get thrown in the same bucket as other. So she actually, and this is what I've always felt, but she articulated it where we want to get away from the use of the word third gender because it is still centering the gender binary. It's centering the two genders, and the third is separate and othered. Another thing about LGBTQ plus identities is Binawen talked about this. When we do inclusion and sameness, we erase intersectionality and enable co-optation. Now, by that, I mean, she gave the example of transgender. So sometimes when people say all transgender people experience more violence, as an example, but when you drill down into the data, at least in the US, who is killed more often of transgender people is those who are Black and those who are indigenous. So when someone says transgender, there's no race in there, right? Transgender is separate from race. And then we talk about it like it affects everybody the same, but it doesn't. It affects people of different backgrounds and races differently. So these labels, again, they're useful in a lot of contexts, but they also can replicate domination and colonization. Another example is homo nationalism. So, homo nationalism is the romanticization of civilization by looking at those countries that allow gay marriage or are accepting of LGBTQ plus people. They are more civilized than those who are homophobic. And this has been used to justify racism. I've heard a lot of people, they'll say, oh, we don't have it as bad in the West as they do in Africa or as they do in the Middle East, those horrible, barbaric places. And this reinforces, gives excuse to be anti-Black and to be Islamophobic. So unfortunately, that's how this gets weaponized. And the homophobia and looking at them as uncivilized and morally deficient, it also ignores the complex racialized histories behind why, for example, same-sex marriage might be resisted. In Hawaii, there were many Kanaka Maoli or Hawaiians who opposed same-sex marriage, but it was not because they were homophobic. That's what a lot of non-Hawaiians labeled Hawaiians as. They said, "Oh, Hawaiians just like these other communities, they're very homophobic." No, it's because marriage is a colonial Western institution that was imposed on us to disempower us in throughout history. So the resistance had nothing to do with homophobia and more so to do with the colonial history and more imposition of Western worldview. But see, when we just talk about homo nationalism, it just ignores all that history. Once again, when we ignore the history, we replicate the domination. Pronouns. So this is a very touchy one because pronouns has given a lot of people visibility. But at the same time, pronouns has become compulsory identification. Everyone has to do it or they are shamed for not doing it. I've had people who are queer and not queer on the side will complain and be like, so and so doesn't have their pronouns up. What's wrong with them? Are they homophobic? Like the judgment is instant because everybody is expected to have it. But there are lots of queer people, indigenous or not, who have said, for me personally, like for me, I don't put pronouns because as Kanaka Maoli, I just don't, it's not a way I want to express my queer identity. But I know that I've gotten some feedback from people where they're like, you're doing all this work to advocate and you're not even putting your pronouns. And then I have to explain to people there's a reason. And that's just not how I want to identify myself as a queer person. Um, and the other thing is that it recolonizes indigenous ways of knowing and being by centering Western worldview, by centering those gendered pronouns. Because, for instance, in a lot of languages, in Filipino, Tagalog, in Olelo Hawaii, in Native Hawaiian language, we don't have gendered pronouns. It is just gender neutral. So we don't necessarily identify ourselves those ways. I am still going to respect someone who asks me to address them as a certain pronoun. I'm going to do my darndest to make sure that I respect that. So it's not the practice that's the problem, but it's kind of like this one single story. Everyone has to have pronouns. No, that's the whole point of trying to expand the bounds of queerness, right? Is allowing us to express ourselves in the way we see fit as opposed to imposing a certain way. And lastly, LGBTQ plus rights. As an example, same-sex marriage is very often used as like the signal of how accepting a society is. And the thing with this is that it ignores colonial histories by focusing on Western pursuits. So I hear a lot of people say, you all got marriage, everything's fixed. But no, we haven't contended with any of the history yet. Um, and when we don't contend with the history, it maintains the existing power structure where indigenous people are displaced and invisible because it is often seen, right? Like, okay, marriage is solved, we're good. If we can get rights for transgender access to medical care, we're good. That's it. Now, those things are important, but they end up being the only thing that's focused on, and all the rest of it is not acknowledged. Or I recently gave a presentation to our Commission on LGBTQ plus equality, and they said, oh, this is important stuff, but it feels like a luxury. So they're seeing it as less important. So that's where this focus on rights in the settler context can take away from us addressing power differentials that exist in society still. So when this domination is replicated, it's because of a lack of awareness, right? And I can say right now, a lot of this research I'm presenting to you, I found it in the last 4 years. I didn't know any of this before then. I had to go find it, and I had a lack of awareness too. And when we're not aware though, that's when we replicate it. So how do we avoid replicating domination today? How do we avoid continuing colonization? So this is where I'm going to look at the term decolonization. So decolonization, as described by Lenny Mendoza Strobel, who is a Filipina scholar, she said it is empowerment through consciousness raising, which is just a big way of saying making ourselves more aware. And in this consciousness raising, we need to unlearn a colonial mentality, that mentality that has us focus on one story, one static story. Now, she describes colonial mentality as a state of marginal consciousness, which lacks critical awareness of the forces of domination and oppression that shape attitudes, values, and behavior. This goes back to contending with history, right? Like if we're not aware of the origins of violence against trans and non-binary people, or aware of how indigenous people have disempowered, we can't rectify those things or change how we behave today if we're not aware of what happened before. We're just going to continue with many things that we assume have always been the truth when they haven't always been. Just like with the gender binary, right? When we looked across the globe, that was not the truth before. But we've gotten into a place where, at least in the West, where we just assume that. So here's how we can decolonize. Just a few suggestions and thoughts and how I've adjusted my thinking. We discern power. So how is the power created then, and how does it follow us forward? And then we do the opposite of what is dominating. So as an example, domination is to suppress the past, like people who say we shouldn't be talking about colonization because it's in the past. But we can't uproot colonization unless we look at the past and contend with it. Now, when I say contend with it, Some people will say, well, yeah, I know about the overthrow. I know about the queen. I know about what happened to Hawaii, but they talk about it like it's in a compartment in the past. But contending with the past means we look at the past and we think, how is that influencing how we act today, how we think today? So we need to contend with that in order to start healing and get away from domination. Another thing, domination focused on singular stories, normalization, making this thing is normal, this thing is not. That's why we need the label queer, because queerness, queerification, goes against normalization and instead looks at plurality, right? Nothing, there's no such thing as normal. Because when you say something is normal or traditional, according to who? We have so many different peoples on this planet, so many different cultures and worldviews. We can't say that one thing is normal. So it's healing is getting away from those singular stories, away from that domination, and seeing plurality in the world again. And related to this, instead of seeing our identities as static and insular, where it's just you are this and you're always going to be that, looking at fluidity and relationality, instead focusing on how we relate to each other and how does that articulate who we are to our community. That's where we can find healing again. And another thing, colonization, domination was about emotional distance. We resist that by connecting again and caring about each other. And to that point about care, remember we talked about how women were disempowered and queer people were exterminated because effeminacy, hermaphrodites, all of that, it was connected to caring work, what people in the West call women's work. And it's called that to disempower it, right? To make it seem not important. And so in colonization, it was about killing the healer, right? We can't have care. We don't want care. We want to just be able to just go about our capitalist way and just dominate people. Instead, we need to shift back to honoring the healer. And who are our healers? It's women. It's Mahu, Babaylan, Two-Spirit, Mutang in Korea, Hijra in Sagoma in Africa. All of these different kinds of peoples where healers were the ones who carry and still carry, we still do it now. We carry the caring work. But that caring work is very often not valued. It's not valued, actually. Let me say not very often. It is not valued in a capitalist system because caring does not help capitalism. If we care about people, we can't exploit people. And capitalism has become certainly very much about exploitation, and it started like that with colonization as well. Okay? So it's just about doing the opposite of domination and remembering our healing powers and our ability to connect with each other and relate to each other in the present, and looking at how we can change the past and how it affects us now. Okay, that is it for the presentation part. I'm going to very quickly put in the chat a online course that I created on sabbatical, which is called Pukamai Kekoa. This is completely free. It's asynchronous. You can do it at your own pace. It's all online, and you don't have to register for it or anything. You can just jump on that page, and it already has all the modules up, and you can do it at your leisure. I've been trying to get this. I just published it March of this year, so it's been gaining traction. It's been getting used in UH courses. So if ever you folks want to use it in courses that you're teaching or with other people, please feel free. But yes, please share that if you might find it interesting or if you know others who might find it interesting. Yeah. Okay.